Wonderful. Thank you all for having me here today. It's exciting to come along to this, especially I met Colin and Louis online over COVID. So it's nice to, well, I've seen Louis in person before, but to see Colin in person and a whole bunch of others that I met. So today I'm going to give you a flavour of some work we've been doing on state and transition models in recent times in Australia. It's going to be, I'm afraid, a bit more of a context-setting talk. There's not much modelling in this talk, but it will be followed by a talk by my postdoc, Jamie, who manages to get his hands more dirty with me than I can with modelling. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors in this presentation. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge country, which is something that we do before meetings in Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I usually live and work in Darwin, Australia. The Larrakia people are the traditional owners of those lands, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to the First Nations peoples of the lands that we're meeting on today. They're tribes of the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Ute, and the Oceti-Sakowin. So the Australian Ecosystem Models Framework is something we've been working on for a number of years now, since 2017. And it was started in an effort to understand and describe landscape change, particularly in the context of evaluating management effectiveness of different government programs that were funding land management actions. These might be things like grazing land management or fire management, weed control. And these programs were trying to improve ecosystem condition. But we're struggling to sort of generate or display how effective that was. So we pulled the framework together as a consistent way to describe landscape change and to detect transitions that alter ecosystem integrity that can be used in a way that is useful for decision making. So the framework is a consistent way to describe ecosystem change that alters ecological integrity. It's one of the key aims was to synthesise the deep observational knowledge of ecosystem scientists and other land managers across Australia before that knowledge was lost. And so it's synthesised in a series of booklets that I'll go into now. For the framework, we took the concept of state and transition models, but we needed a way to express changes that occur within a state that cause variability within that state but don't result in a transition to a new state. So how can we identify when we observe variation in structure, function, composition of our ecosystems from space or on ground? When do we know when that change is part of a cycle of disturbance and recovery to which ecosystems have adapted over thousands of years? And when is that change a transformative change that results in a transition to a modified state that would have different ecological condition and different flow of ecosystem services? So you can see an example here. These are some eucalypt woodlands in southwestern Australia. On the left are some photographs of York gum woodlands at different times since fire. So these are fire disturbed system. They would have very different structure, function and composition in those photographs, but they all represent a change that's part of the reference state. And then we see a transition driven by introduction of grazing, invasive annual species in the understory, loss of fire from these systems and other disturbances that result in this modified state that still has those cycles of disturbance and biomass recovery, but modified. So the framework it consists of two parts. The first part are a set of archetype dynamic ecosystem models. So these were pulled together through a number of years of talking to lots and lots of experts across Australia, and they describe the reference disturbance and biomass recovery dynamics of ecosystems that display integrity. So they're the dynamics that ecosystems have adapted to over thousands of years. They include anthropogenically driven disturbances and non-anthropogenic actions as well. So they include Indigenous fire management and flood management. There are 46 of these models for the Australian continent, so you can imagine how high level they are. And they're grouped by common disturbance drivers. And they include all ecosystems down to the intertidal zone, but they don't include in-channel freshwater aquatic systems or the marine realm. What we do when we use the framework is we take these archetype models and they provide templates for the development of state and transition models which occur at regional and local scales. So we move from a conceptual model to one that has numbers in it related to those disturbance return intervals that are characteristic of that particular region. And in these state and transition models, of course, we have the reference state and we have these modified states. And you'll see those green boxes we call expressions. They're the descriptions of that transient variability that we observe within states. So these archetype models are grouped into what we call vegetation umbrella classes, and there's 14 of these. And the reason we did this is it links through to our National Vegetation Classification System, which was important when we were talking to experts, because you needed a sort of a grounding point that was based in experiential knowledge for experts to understand how we reclassify things according to disturbance regimes. So these sort of vegetation classes provide an entry point rather than if you like, a way we can map these archetype models, but they provide a useful piece of information as part of that mapping exercise. So if you go into one of these classes, the eucalypt woodland class, we've got 5 archetype models. So these are 5 distinct or discrete disturbance and biomass recovery dynamics that we observe in eucalypt woodlands across the Australian continent. So the differences are in terms of their response to fire. So we have obligate seeding eucalypt woodlands and resprouting woodlands. We have woodlands that are disturbed predominantly by flood and drought regimes, others that are disturbed by wind and fire, and others that are disturbed by fire and drought. So if I go into one of these, this is floodplain eucalypt woodlands and forests. These occur across our river systems, across the continent. Got some photographs here on the left. These are photographs of the expressions, which are those boxes within this archetype model for a river red gum floodplain woodland that occurs on the River Murray in southern Australia. Within the model, we have quite a lot of text that accompanies the box and arrow diagram, but in the diagram we have a dark green box which represents the dominant expression. It's probably what you would picture if you pictured these woodlands or came across them. So it's the most commonly observed expression in these landscapes, but we also see other expressions that occur as a result of different inundation regimes. We have also some expressions that have got those thick green borders, and these are expressions that occur in other archetype models. So these represent ecotonal or long-term dynamics. So in this case, it's long-term inundation as a result of geomorphological changes across a floodplain. So I wanted to give you a flavour of some of the applications of this framework that we've been working on over a number of years, and one of them particularly has been in ecosystem accounting. Ecosystem accounts are a coherent set of environmental, social, cultural and economic information about ecosystems, and it's critical that they actually measure the ecosystem's contribution to delivering an ecosystem service. So this might be food and timber provision, or it could be climate regulation, water supply, recreation, and so on. They're produced using the System of Environmental Economic Accounting Ecosystem Accounting Framework that's released by the United Nations. Accounts are always describing past to present information about ecosystems, and they always need to be spatially complete for the ecosystem accounting area for which they're produced. And they generally follow a sort of standard set of tables or accounts, if you like. So you produce an ecosystem extent account and condition account, and they then flow into an ecosystem services account, which is usually tracking physical flow of ecosystem services. And then you go into benefits, which might be monetary or non-monetary valuation of those services. And you can have thematic accounts linked in here, and I've put an example there of a biodiversity account. So we've been using the concept of state and transition models as a way to produce coherent and connected ecosystem accounts in Australia. We've been doing this for a number of years. We've started producing accounts for local scale applications. We've moved into regional ecosystem accounts, which I'll give an example here. So large regions, and then we're starting to work on national ecosystem accounts for the continent. These work by using those archetype models that I described before from the Australian Ecosystem Models Framework, which we take to expert elicitation workshops. This was a workshop for a case study in a pilot region in North Queensland. And then experts develop these state and transition models or description of ecosystem states across that pilot region. We also worked with First Nations peoples in those regions to understand their viewpoints on state and transition models and perspectives on ecosystem accounting. And we got some recommendations for how we might improve or produce these accounts in a way that better reflects First Nations knowledge and values in those regions. Once we have the ecosystem state and transition models described, we have a set of ecosystem states and their expressions, that internal variability. We have in these models a lot of quantitative information, so information on cover, species composition and so forth, and these are used as a rule set for developing ecosystem extent accounts. So we use those rules to interpret various lines of evidence from remote sensing information or on-ground information, produce a map of ecosystem types and states, usually over a historical time period, in this case over 30 years, and then an account which shows the change in extent of those states and expressions over time. We then use another expert elicitation exercise to generate an ecosystem condition or departure from reference score for each of those ecosystem states. And this is aggregated with a separate method for measuring ecosystem condition, the Habitat Condition Assessment System, which is a remote sensing based tool for measuring condition. So one is a sort of a top-down measurement of ecosystem condition, one's a bottom-up, and that is aggregated into the condition account. And you can probably see from this diagram, when you see a change in extent of your ecosystem states, you should see a concurrent change in your ecosystem condition account. It provides a useful piece of information for providing reasons for change in your accounts over time. And this information is then fed into biodiversity models, so we can produce biodiversity accounts, carbon models for carbon storage, sequestration, and other services. So just a small snapshot of some of the information that's coming out of these accounts. This is the region in North Queensland. It's 3 river catchments. I just pulled out 2 examples of the largest ecosystems in that region, these floodplain forests that I showed before and some extensive tussock grasslands. And you can see a declining trend over 30 years of ecosystem condition for both of those different ecosystems, albeit the floodplain forests are in better condition than the tussock grasslands. But the useful thing is that we can use the state and transition model, particularly those drivers of change in the transitions that we elicited from experts, to bundle ecosystem services. So we can see how changes in those landscapes result in a change in flow of services. So you don't need to look at the detail, but if you see these spider plots and they have different shaped colours, it shows you how you're seeing a change across different states, which are demonstrated by photographs here, in condition, threatened species habitat, carbon storage, sequestration, provision of cattle and calves for production. And then the last account that we did was a capacity account, which is the potential for sustainable production of livestock from these ecosystem states that wouldn't result in a degradation. So it's versus the other one, which is an actual measured production number. So this is sort of just using state and transition models, but not moving into a simulation framework, which is why we're all here today. And it's something we've been interested in as well, and particularly forecasting landscape change into the future and how that might change some of these values that we're measuring in accounts. And so we developed a collaboration a few years ago with Colin and Louis, and have started to try and start to use state and transition simulation models. And I'm going to give 3 quick examples of where we're applying these or starting to apply these now. This is the most recent example. The federal government in Australia is setting up, putting forward legislation for nature repair markets, which will be a voluntary market for businesses to invest in nature repair. So it would support projects put up by private landowners for protection and/or enhancement of biodiversity. So state and transition models could provide a mechanism, along with habitat-based biodiversity assessment, for projecting or forecasting changes in ecological integrity and biodiversity persistence in landscapes into the future under different management interventions that could be put forward by proponents in the market. Another example is some work done by a postdoc of mine, Katrina Zete, shown here, funded by a future science platform on valuing sustainability. And she's very interested in modelling future socio-ecological states in production-focused landscapes in Australia and east and west coast of Australia. So she's using state and transition models combined with climate projections, and also developing narratives of socioeconomic scenarios into the future. And she's developing an interesting collaboration with an arts collective called Interactive that do participatory gaming to elicit understanding of complex system science and to develop these narratives around socioeconomic change in these landscapes, and that allows her to develop plausible futures and options, thresholds and tipping points for these locations. The other thing she's exploring is immersive visualization technology as a tool that could improve the way we produce the models by democratizing the way we display how these models work, but also a useful tool perhaps for validating the model outputs. And lastly, you'll hear up next from my postdoc, Jamie Furlow, who'll be talking to you about exploring state and transition models, simulation models with Colin and Louis in order to understand the risk to ecological assets from bushfires under future climates in flammable landscapes in northern Australia and southwest Tasmania. And thank you for your time.